Jacob Hayes stood between a loaded rifle and the wild horse that had already trampled 3 men to death, his hand raised to stop the execution. The town thought he was insane, but Jacob saw something in those dark eyes that everyone else had missed, something worth risking everything. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The Black Stallion had killed 3 men, or so the rumors claimed, as they spread through Copper Creek like wildfire in dry season. Jacob Hayes stood at the edge of the makeshift corral behind the livery stable, watching the magnificent creature pace the fence line with eyes that held more intelligence than fear, more defiance than madness. The horse was lean from neglect, its coat dull beneath a layer of prairie dust, but even in its diminished state, Jacob could see the power coiled in those muscles, the nobility in the arch of that neck. This was no devil horse. This was a survivor, and Jacob knew something about survival. At 38 years old, Jacob carried his own scars from a life lived hard on the frontier. His left hand bore the twisted skin of an old rope burn that had nearly cost him 2 fingers. His back held the memory of a bronco that had thrown him into a fence post, leaving him unable to work for 3 months. His heart carried wounds that ran deeper still, placed there by a wife who had left him for a merchant in St. Louis, unable to bear the loneliness of ranch life, and a husband who spoke more easily to horses than to people. The townspeople of Copper Creek treated him with a mixture of respect and wariness. He was known as the best horse handler in 3 counties, a man who could gentle the wildest Mustang with patience and understanding rather than force, but he was also known as peculiar, solitary, a man who preferred the company of animals to that of his fellow humans. The crowd gathering behind him grew larger as word spread that someone was actually considering taking the killer horse. Jacob could hear their whispered conversations, feel their eyes on his back as he studied the stallion. Old Thomas Brennan, who owned the livery, stood nearby with his arms crossed, shaking his head in disapproval. "That horse is dangerous, Jacob," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Killed Jim Patterson when he tried to break him. Broke Doc Morrison's ribs when he got too close. Trampled young Billy Cooper so bad the boy still walks with a limp. Best thing would be to put a bullet in him and be done with it." Jacob didn't turn away from the horse. "What happened to those men wasn't the horse's fault," he replied quietly. "They treated him like an enemy instead of a partner." The murmur of disagreement from the crowd was immediate and vocal. Mrs. Henderson, the mercantile owner's wife, spoke up with indignation clear in her voice. "Are you saying Jim Patterson deserved to die? He was trying to make an honest living breaking horses." Jacob finally turned to face the gathered townspeople, his weathered face calm, but his gray eyes intense. "I'm saying a wild horse doesn't understand breaking. He only understands fear and pain and the need to survive. Every one of those men came at him with whips and ropes and force. They treated him like something to be conquered. Of course he fought back." The crowd was unconvinced. Sheriff Bradley, a broad-shouldered man with a perpetual scowl, stepped forward. "Hayes, that animal is a menace to this community. We've kept him penned up for 2 weeks now while we figured out what to do with him. The general consensus is that he needs to be destroyed before someone else gets hurt." "I'll take him," Jacob said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the crowd's response was immediate and negative. Voices rose in protest, people talking over each other in their rush to explain why this was a terrible idea. Thomas Brennan stepped closer, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "Jacob, be reasonable. That horse is beyond help. Even if he doesn't kill you, he'll never be worth the feed it takes to keep him alive. Nobody can ride him. Nobody can even get near him without risking their neck." "I didn't say I was going to ride him," Jacob replied. "I said I was going to take him. There's a difference." "What's the point of keeping a horse you can't ride?" the sheriff demanded. "What good is he to anyone? Maybe being useful isn't the only reason something deserves to live," Jacob said quietly, his eyes returning to the stallion. The horse had stopped pacing and was watching the crowd, with ears pinned back, nostrils flared, every line of his body screaming distrust and readiness to defend himself. Jacob recognized that stance. He had worn it himself often enough in the years since his wife left, the defensive posture of something that had been hurt too many times to believe in kindness. The argument continued for another 20 minutes, with various townspeople offering their opinions on Jacob's sanity, the horse's evil nature, and the general foolishness of the entire proposition. But Jacob had made up his mind, and those who knew him understood that once Jacob Hayes decided something, he was as immovable as the mountains that ringed their valley. Finally, Thomas Brennan threw up his hands in exasperation. "Fine, take the cursed animal, but when he kills you, don't expect any sympathy from this town, and you'll need to sign a paper releasing me from any liability." Jacob nodded his agreement. "I'll need a few things, a longer lead rope, some grain, and access to the old Patterson place." The ranch had been abandoned after Jim Patterson's death, his widow selling off the livestock and returning east to live with family. The property sat empty, its barn and corrals deteriorating slowly under the relentless prairie sun. "You planning to take him out there?" Sheriff Bradley asked. "That's 5 miles from town. Nobody will hear you scream when he turns on you." "That's exactly why it's perfect," Jacob replied. "No distractions, no crowds, no people trying to help in ways that will only make things worse." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your funeral. Just make sure someone knows to come looking for your body in a few days." As the crowd slowly dispersed, still muttering their disapproval and dire predictions, Jacob approached the corral alone. The stallion's attention fixed on him immediately, ears swiveling forward, body tensing for whatever threat this human might present. Jacob stopped 10 feet from the fence and simply stood there, making no move to enter the enclosure, no attempt to approach the horse. He just stood and watched, his posture relaxed, his breathing calm and steady. The horse watched him back, confusion gradually replacing some of the aggression in its stance. This human wasn't advancing with weapons or ropes, wasn't shouting or making threatening gestures, was simply standing there, patient and still, as if he had all the time in the world. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The afternoon sun climbed higher, and still Jacob stood there, occasionally shifting his weight but never moving toward the fence. Some of the townspeople who had lingered to watch grew bored and left. Others remained, fascinated despite themselves by this strange interaction or lack thereof. After nearly an hour, the stallion took a single step toward Jacob, then another. His movements were cautious, suspicious, ready to bolt or attack at the first sign of threat. But Jacob remained motionless, his eyes soft, his entire demeanor projecting a calm acceptance that seemed to intrigue the horse. When the stallion finally reached the fence, stopping just beyond reach, Jacob spoke for the first time. His voice was low and gentle, barely above a whisper. "I know what they did to you. I know you've got every reason to hate us. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm just asking you to give me a chance to prove that not all humans are your enemy." The horse's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, and something in those dark eyes seemed to shift, just slightly. It wasn't trust, not yet, but perhaps it was the faintest beginning of curiosity. Jacob allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we start over, both of us." The morning Jacob arrived at the abandoned Patterson place, the sun was barely a suggestion on the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep purple and orange that reminded him of a bruise in various stages of healing. He had loaded his wagon before dawn with supplies that had raised eyebrows at the mercantile the previous evening. No saddle, no breaking equipment, no whips or spurs or any of the traditional tools of horse training. Instead, he had purchased grain, hay, rope for fence repairs, basic camping supplies, and several books that Thomas Brennan had looked at with undisguised confusion. The stallion had been transported in a reinforced wagon the day before, still penned, but now in the larger corral at the Patterson Ranch. Jacob had specifically requested that no one attempt to move the horse from the wagon to the corral until he arrived to supervise. He knew that every interaction the horse had with humans reinforced either trust or fear, and he wanted to control as many of those interactions as possible from this point forward. When he arrived, he found Sheriff Bradley waiting for him, leaning against the corral fence with his arms crossed and a skeptical expression that seemed permanently etched into his weathered features. "Figured you might need help getting him settled," the sheriff said, though his tone suggested he had come more to witness Jacob's inevitable failure than to offer genuine assistance. Jacob climbed down from his wagon and began unloading supplies with methodical efficiency. "I appreciate the thought, Sheriff, but I'll be handling this alone. No offense intended, but every person who gets involved is another variable the horse has to process, another potential threat." The sheriff watched as Jacob carried bags of grain into the barn, his movements unhurried and deliberate. "You really think you can gentle that animal after what he's done?" "I think that animal, as you call him, has been through more trauma in the past few months than most creatures endure in a lifetime," Jacob replied. "He's not evil, Sheriff. He's terrified and angry and doing the only thing he knows how to do, which is fight to survive." The sheriff pushed away from the fence, shaking his head. "I've known you for 15 years, Jacob, and I've never understood the way you think about animals. They're tools, meant to serve a purpose. When a tool breaks and becomes dangerous, you replace it. You don't waste time and money trying to fix something that's fundamentally flawed." Jacob stopped his work and looked at the sheriff directly. "Is that how you see people too? When someone breaks under the weight of hardship or trauma, do you just discard them as fundamentally flawed?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made the sheriff uncomfortable. He shifted his weight and cleared his throat. "That's different. We're talking about a horse, are we?" Jacob asked quietly, then returned to his unloading, effectively ending the conversation. After the sheriff left, Jacob spent the first 2 hours simply making the ranch habitable again. The barn needed mucking out and fresh straw. The water troughs needed cleaning and filling. The fences required repairs in several places where weather and neglect had weakened the posts. He worked steadily, aware that the stallion was watching him from the transport wagon, those intelligent eyes tracking his every movement. Jacob made no attempt to approach the wagon or interact with the horse directly. He simply went about his work, establishing a routine that the horse could observe and perhaps begin to understand as non-threatening. By mid-morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the coolness of dawn, Jacob finally approached the transport wagon. He moved slowly, telegraphing his intentions with his body language, making himself as non-threatening as possible. The stallion's ears pinned back immediately, and Jacob could see the muscles bunching under that dusty coat, preparing for violence if necessary. "I'm going to open this gate," Jacob said in the same low, calm voice he had used the day before. "You can come out when you're ready. Nobody's going to rush you or force you. This is your home now, and you get to decide how fast we move." He unlatched the gate that led from the wagon into the larger corral, then immediately stepped away, retreating to a position near the barn where he could watch without crowding. The stallion remained in the wagon for nearly 20 minutes, suspicious of this unexpected freedom, waiting for the trap he was certain must be coming. When Jacob made no move to approach or threaten, the horse finally took a tentative step toward the open gate. Then another. Then, in a sudden burst of decision, he bolted from the wagon into the corral, immediately running to the farthest corner and wheeling to face Jacob with his back against the fence. Jacob remained motionless, letting the horse process this new environment without adding the stress of human presence. The corral was large, perhaps 60 feet square, with solid fencing that was high enough to contain even a determined jumper. There was shade from a lean-to attached to the barn, fresh water in a trough that Jacob had filled earlier, and most importantly, space. Room to move, to pace, to feel less trapped than he had been in the cramped transport wagon. After watching the horse settle slightly, Jacob turned his attention back to the barn, continuing his work as if the stallion were of no particular interest to him. This apparent indifference was calculated. Every horse trainer Jacob had ever known approached breaking with the philosophy of establishing dominance, of showing the horse who was in control. Jacob's method was the opposite. He wanted the horse to see him as non-threatening, as simply another creature sharing space before any real interaction could begin. The day passed in this way, with Jacob working on various tasks around the property while the stallion watched from his corner of the corral. Jacob repaired fence posts, organized the barn, cleaned out the old tack room that still held the ghost of Jim Patterson's presence in the form of abandoned equipment and faded photographs tacked to the wall. He worked until the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the prairie in those same bruised colors that had greeted the morning. As evening approached, Jacob prepared his own camp in the barn's loft, spreading out a bedroll and setting up a small area for cooking. He had no intention of leaving the horse alone during these crucial early days. His presence needed to become as constant and unthreatening as the fence posts or the water trough, just another element of the horse's environment that posed no danger. Before settling in for the night, Jacob brought a bucket of grain to the corral and poured it into the feeding trough, then retreated to the barn without waiting to see if the horse would approach. This too was calculated. The horse needed to learn that Jacob's presence meant positive things like food and water, but without the pressure of being watched or judged while accepting these offerings. From the loft window, Jacob could see the stallion in the gathering darkness. The horse had moved closer to the center of the corral, no longer pressed against the back fence in defensive terror. After Jacob had been still and quiet for perhaps 20 minutes, the stallion cautiously approached the feeding trough and began to eat. Jacob watched the horse in the moonlight that had begun to silver the prairie and felt something shift in his chest. This magnificent creature, so badly damaged by human cruelty, was still capable of trust, still willing to take the risk of accepting food from the hand that had brought it. The resilience required for that simple act of eating was staggering when Jacob considered what the horse had endured. In that moment, watching the stallion feed under the stars, Jacob made a silent promise. He would prove to this horse that not all humans were enemies, that patience could triumph over force, that healing was possible even for the most deeply wounded souls. It was a promise he had failed to keep with his wife, who had needed a kind of patience and understanding he had not known how to give. But perhaps he could keep it with this horse. Perhaps, in healing this broken animal, he might also heal something in himself that had been damaged beyond what he had been willing to acknowledge. The night settled over the Patterson ranch, cool and quiet except for the sound of the horse eating and the distant call of coyotes hunting in the hills. Jacob lay in his bedroll, not sleeping, but listening, bearing witness to the small victory of a traumatized creature accepting nourishment, and feeling something like hope stir in a heart he had thought was finished with such feelings. The first week passed in a rhythm of patience and repetition that would have driven most men to distraction. Jacob rose before dawn each day, moving through the same routine with deliberate consistency. He would climb down from the loft, build a small fire for coffee, then go about the morning chores while the stallion watched from whatever corner of the corral he had chosen for the night. The horse was always awake when Jacob emerged, always alert, those dark eyes tracking every movement as if cataloging potential threats. Jacob would fill the water trough first, speaking quietly as he worked, not directing his words at the horse specifically, but simply narrating his actions in that low, calm voice that had become a constant presence. "Water's fresh this morning, cold from the well. Good for a hot day like this one's going to be." Then he would measure out grain and hay, always the same amounts at the same times, establishing a predictability that he hoped would become comfort. The horse never approached while Jacob was nearby. As soon as Jacob retreated to a respectful distance, the stallion would move to the food, eating quickly at first, as if expecting it to be snatched away, then gradually with more ease as the days passed and the food remained unmolested. By the third day, the horse had stopped pressing himself against the far fence. By the fifth day, he was standing in the center of the corral when Jacob emerged each morning, still watchful but no longer in a constant state of fight-or-flight terror. These small changes were victories that Jacob celebrated privately, knowing that trust was built in increments so small they were almost invisible until you looked back and realized how far you had come. On the seventh day, something remarkable happened. Jacob was repairing a section of fence along the corral's eastern side, his back to the horse as he worked to reset a post that had begun to lean. The work required concentration and physical effort, and for a few moments Jacob's attention was entirely focused on the task rather than on maintaining his awareness of the stallion's position. When he finally stepped back to examine his work, he realized the horse had moved to within 10 feet of him, not approaching directly, not making any obvious gesture of connection, but simply standing there watching with an expression that seemed more curious than afraid. Jacob's heart rate increased, but he forced himself to remain calm, to treat this development as unremarkable. He went back to his fence repair without acknowledging the horse's presence, giving the animal the dignity of approaching without being made to feel observed or judged. They stayed that way for perhaps 20 minutes, man working and horse watching, the distance between them no longer quite so insurmountable as it had been a week before. That evening, Jacob sat on an overturned bucket near the barn door, eating his simple supper of beans and hardtack, while the sun painted the sky in its nightly display of color. The stallion was at the water trough, drinking deeply, and Jacob watched the play of fading light on that dusty black coat. Even malnourished and neglected, there was a beauty to this animal that took his breath away. The power in those shoulders, the intelligence in those eyes, the sheer will to survive that had carried the horse through months of abuse and fear. "You're going to be magnificent when we get some weight on you," Jacob said quietly, not expecting any response but needing to voice the thought that had been growing in his mind. "Going to need a name, too. Can't keep calling you horse." The stallion's ears swiveled toward the sound of Jacob's voice, water dripping from his muzzle as he lifted his head. The two regarded each other across the corral, and Jacob felt that strange connection again, that sense of recognition between two damaged creatures who understood survival in ways that the comfortable and safe never could. "How about Shadow?" Jacob suggested. "For all the darkness you've known, but also for the way you move, quiet and powerful." The horse snorted. Whether in agreement or simple equine commentary on the quality of the water, Jacob couldn't say. But the name felt right, felt like something solid he could hold on to as they continued this careful dance of trust building. The second week brought visitors despite Jacob's preference for isolation during this delicate period. Thomas Brennan arrived on the 10th day, driving his wagon up the rutted path to the ranch with obvious reluctance. He climbed down slowly, his age showing in the careful way he moved, and approached the corral with the air of a man expecting to find a corpse. "Well," the old liveryman said, genuine surprise in his voice, "you're still alive. That's more than most of us expected." Jacob was sitting on the top rail of a secondary corral he had been repairing, whittling a piece of wood into something that might eventually become a handle for a new bucket. "Still breathing," he confirmed. "How's the horse?" Brennan asked, peering into the main corral where Shadow stood in the shade of the lean-to. "Shadow," Jacob corrected gently. "His name is Shadow, and he's doing better, eating regularly, drinking well, starting to show some curiosity instead of just fear." Brennan studied the horse with the expert eye of someone who had spent 50 years around equines. "He does look calmer," the old man admitted. "Still wouldn't want to get in there with him, mind you, but he's not showing that wild-eyed panic he had when we first penned him. That's because he's starting to understand that he's safe here, Jacob explained, climbing down from his perch. That nobody's going to hurt him or force him or try to break his spirit. He just needed time and space to realize that not all humans are his enemy. Brennan shook his head in that way people do when confronted with something they don't quite understand but can't entirely dismiss. You always did have an odd way with horses, Jacob. I've seen you work miracles with animals other men had given up on. But this one, he paused, searching for words. This one's different. He's killed, Jacob. That changes things. Does it? Jacob asked. If a man kills because he's defending himself from attack, we call that justified. Why should it be different for a horse? Because horses are supposed to serve us, Brennan replied, as if this were self-evident. They're supposed to accept training and human authority. When they don't, when they fight back, they're dangerous. Jacob looked at the old man with something like pity. That's the difference between you and me, Thomas. You see horses as tools that should submit to human will. I see them as beings with their own right to dignity and respect. Shadow didn't kill because he's evil or broken. He killed because men came at him with violence, and he defended himself the only way he knew how. Brennan was quiet for a long moment, watching Shadow drink from the trough. Maybe you're right, he said finally. Maybe I'm too old to change my thinking. But I'll tell you this much, Jacob Hayes. If anyone can prove that horse deserves a second chance, it's you. After Brennan left, Jacob returned to his work on the secondary corral. He had a plan forming in his mind, a way to give Shadow even more space and freedom while maintaining safety for both of them. The secondary corral connected to the main one through a gate that was currently closed. If he could get Shadow comfortable enough to move between the two spaces, it would double the horse's territory and give them both more options for interaction. But that was still weeks away, maybe months. For now, the important thing was simply to continue showing up, continue being present without being threatening, continue proving through action rather than words that Jacob meant what he said about safety and respect. As evening fell and Jacob prepared his simple supper, he noticed Shadow had moved closer to the barn again, standing perhaps 15 feet from where Jacob sat. The horse was watching him with those intelligent eyes, and Jacob could almost see the calculations happening behind them. This human had been present for 2 weeks now without offering violence. This human brought food and water and fixed things and spoke in quiet tones that never held threat. Could this human possibly be trusted, even slightly? Jacob met the horse's gaze and felt something shift between them, subtle but significant. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of possibility. Shadow, he said quietly, I know you're still afraid. I know you've got every reason to be, but I promise you, we're going to take this as slow as you need. No rushing, no forcing, no breaking, just time and patience and respect. The horse's ears flicked forward at the sound of his name, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, Jacob thought he saw something soften in those dark eyes. Then Shadow turned away, moving back to his corner of the corral, but the moment had been real, and it was enough. The breakthrough came on a morning when the world seemed determined to prove that nature cared nothing for human plans or patience. Jacob woke to the sound of thunder rolling across the prairie like artillery fire, and when he climbed down from the loft, he could see the storm building on the western horizon, massive clouds the color of old bruises stacking themselves into towers that reached toward heaven. The air had that peculiar quality it gets before violent weather, heavy and electric, making the hair on his arms stand up and his skin prickle with anticipation. Shadow was already agitated when Jacob emerged from the barn. The horse was pacing the corral in tight circles, his ears swiveling constantly. His nostrils flared as he tested the air for the danger his instincts told him was coming. Jacob understood. Wild horses feared storms for good reason. Lightning could kill, flash floods could drown, and the noise and chaos could scatter a herd or drive predators from their dens. For Shadow, With his history of human-inflicted trauma, the approaching storm must have felt like another attack, another threat to survival in a world that had already proven itself hostile beyond measure. Jacob moved carefully, keeping his movements slow and predictable despite the urgency he felt. The storm was coming fast, faster than he had initially thought, and he needed to make sure everything was secured before it hit. He checked the barn doors, tested the latches on the corral gates, made sure the water troughs were positioned where they wouldn't overflow and flood. All the while, he kept up his quiet narration, his voice steady, even as the wind began to pick up and the first fat drops of rain started to fall. "Big storm coming, Shadow. Going to be loud and scary, but you're safe here. The barn's solid, the fences are strong, and I'm not going anywhere." The horse seemed to find some comfort in Jacob's voice, even if the words themselves meant nothing. Shadow's pacing slowed slightly and his attention fixed on Jacob rather than on the approaching storm. It was a small thing, this choice to focus on the familiar human presence rather than the unfamiliar threat. But Jacob recognized it for what it was. Shadow was beginning to trust, not fully, not without reservation, but enough to seek reassurance from Jacob's presence when fear threatened to overwhelm him. When the storm finally broke, it did so with savage intensity. The rain came down in sheets so thick Jacob could barely see the corral fence from the barn door. Lightning cracked across the sky in brilliant forks that turned the world white for split seconds, before plunging it back into premature darkness. Thunder followed immediately, so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. This was a prairie storm in full fury, the kind that could flatten crops and flood creeks and remind humans of their insignificance against the raw power of nature. Shadow panicked. The careful progress of 3 weeks vanished in an instant as the horse reverted to pure survival instinct. He ran at the fence as if he might somehow crash through it, only pulling up at the last moment and wheeling away. He reared and struck at the air with his front hooves, fighting an enemy he couldn't see or understand. His eyes were wild, showing white all around, and Jacob could hear the harsh rasp of his breathing even over the roar of the storm. Jacob stood in the barn doorway, every instinct screaming at him to stay back, to let the horse work through his panic without adding the complication of human presence. But something stronger than instinct moved him forward. He stepped out into the rain, immediately soaked through, and began walking slowly toward the corral. His hands were empty, his posture as non-threatening as he could make it while fighting the wind that tried to push him sideways. "Shadow," he called, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Shadow, I'm here. You're not alone." The horse saw him coming and spun to face him, ears pinned flat against his skull, teeth bared in a clear warning. For a moment, Jacob thought Shadow might charge the fence, might try to attack him through the rails. The wildness was back in those eyes, the killing rage that had ended 3 men who had approached this horse with violence in their hearts. But Jacob kept walking, kept speaking, kept offering his presence as an anchor in the chaos of the storm. "I know you're scared. I know this feels like the end of the world, but it's just weather, Shadow. Just noise and water and light. It can't hurt you here. You're safe." He reached the fence and stopped, one hand resting on the wet wood, water streaming down his face and plastering his hair to his skull. Shadow stood 15 feet away, trembling with terror and rage, caught between the instinct to flee and the slowly growing trust that maybe, just maybe, this human could be believed when he said everything would be all right. Lightning struck somewhere close enough that Jacob felt the electricity in the air and saw the flash that turned Shadow into a stark silhouette against the blinding light. The thunder that followed was instantaneous and deafening, a physical force that made Jacob's chest vibrate. Shadow screamed, a sound of pure animal terror, and bolted directly toward Jacob. For a heartbeat, Jacob thought his time had come, thought this was how it would end, trampled by the horse he had been trying to save. But Shadow didn't crash into the fence. Instead, he slid to a stop just on the other side of the rails, so close that Jacob could feel the heat of his body, could see every detail of those fear-widened eyes. The horse was breathing hard, his sides heaving, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and terror, and he was looking at Jacob not with rage or the intent to kill, but with something that looked almost like a plea for help. Jacob lifted his hand slowly, telegraphing every movement, and placed it on the fence rail between them. Shadow's eyes tracked the motion, but he didn't pull away. For the first time since arriving at this ranch, since being captured and penned and abused by humans who saw him as nothing more than a dangerous animal to be destroyed, Shadow held his ground in close proximity to a human hand, not touching, not yet ready for that level of trust, but not fleeing either. Just standing there in the rain and wind and thunder, choosing to believe that maybe Jacob meant what he had been saying for 3 weeks. The storm raged around them for another hour, but something fundamental had changed. Shadow stayed near the fence where Jacob stood, and though he flinched at each crack of lightning and roll of thunder, he didn't bolt. He had found his anchor, his safe point in the chaos, and that safe point was the patient man who had spent weeks proving that he could be trusted. Jacob stayed with him through it all, soaked to the bone and starting to shake with cold, but unwilling to abandon Shadow when the horse had finally chosen to trust him, even in this small way. When the storm finally moved on, heading east toward the mountains with its fury gradually diminishing, the world was transformed. Everything was washed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone, and the late afternoon sun broke through the remaining clouds in golden beams that seemed almost holy in their beauty. Jacob was exhausted, cold to his core, and his legs were cramping from standing in one position for so long. But when he looked at Shadow, standing quiet now in the center of the corral with water dripping from his mane and the wildness finally gone from his eyes, Jacob felt something like joy. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. "You trusted me, even when everything in you was screaming to run or fight. That took courage, Shadow. More courage than most people ever have to show." The horse was looking at him with those intelligent eyes, and Jacob could swear there was understanding there, recognition of the significance of what had just passed between them. It wasn't full trust, not yet, but it was a beginning, a foundation they could build on. Jacob finally pushed away from the fence, his joints protesting the movement after so long in one position. "I need to get dry clothes and something hot to drink," he told Shadow. "You should eat something too. Food helps with the shakes you get after that much adrenaline." He trudged back to the barn, every step squishing water from his boots, and climbed the ladder to the loft with arms that felt like lead. But as he peeled off his wet clothes and wrapped himself in a blanket, as he built a small fire and heated water for coffee, Jacob couldn't stop smiling. They had crossed a threshold today, man and horse, and there was no going back. After the storm, everything changed between Jacob and Shadow, but in ways so subtle that most people would have missed them entirely. The transformation was not dramatic or sudden, but rather like watching ice melt in early spring, a gradual shift that was only obvious when you looked back and realized how much had changed. Shadow no longer retreated to the far corner when Jacob entered the corral area. Instead, the horse would watch from wherever he happened to be standing, his body language relaxed rather than defensive, his ears forward with interest rather than pinned back in warning. Jacob began spending more time simply being present in Shadow's space without agenda or purpose beyond companionship. He would bring a book and sit on an overturned crate near the barn, reading aloud in that same quiet voice that had become Shadow's constant reassurance. The horse seemed to enjoy the sound of Jacob's voice, often moving closer when the reading began, sometimes standing within 20 feet, while Jacob narrated tales of adventure and exploration from volumes he had carried with him for years. Other times, Jacob would simply sit in comfortable silence, whittling or mending equipment, while Shadow grazed on the hay Jacob had spread across the corral. The townspeople continued to visit, drawn by curiosity about the man living alone with the killer horse. Each visitor brought their own expectations and predictions, most of them dark. Mrs. Henderson arrived in the 4th week with a basket of food that she pressed into Jacob's hands with genuine concern creasing her face. "You're looking thin," she said, her eyes scanning him critically. "Are you eating properly out here all alone?" Jacob accepted the basket with gratitude, touched by her concern despite his preference for solitude. "I'm managing fine, Mrs. Henderson, but I appreciate your kindness." She peered past him toward the corral where Shadow stood, watching their interaction with alert interest. "That horse still looks dangerous to me," she said with a shiver. "Those eyes, they're too intelligent, like he's planning something." Jacob smiled despite himself. "Intelligence isn't dangerous," he replied. "Fear and pain make creatures dangerous. Shadow's learning that he doesn't need to be afraid anymore." The woman shook her head, unconvinced but unwilling to argue. "Just promise me you'll be careful. The town would hate to lose you, even if you are peculiar in your ways." After she left, Jacob brought the basket to his usual spot near the barn and began unpacking its contents. Fresh bread, cheese, dried apples, and a jar of honey that caught the afternoon light like liquid gold. He broke off a piece of bread and was about to eat it when he noticed Shadow had moved closer than usual, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of the fresh food. For a long moment, Jacob sat very still, considering. Then, moving with exaggerated slowness, he broke off another piece of bread and held it out on his palm, his arm extended but not reaching toward the horse. This was a test, a question posed in the language of trust. Would Shadow take food directly from Jacob's hand? It was a simple act, but it carried weight far beyond the physical. To eat from someone's hand required believing that the hand would not strike or grab or hurt. It required vulnerability that Shadow had never shown to any human. Jacob sat there with his arm outstretched, the bread resting on his open palm, and waited. Shadow's ears swiveled forward and back as the horse processed this new development. Minutes passed. Jacob's arm began to ache from holding the position, but he didn't move, didn't speak, just waited with patience that had become as natural to him as breathing. Finally, Shadow took a single step forward, then another. The horse's approach was cautious, every muscle tensed and ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. But he came closer, drawn by the smell of the bread and perhaps by something deeper, some growing trust that Jacob had been nurturing for a month now. When Shadow was close enough that Jacob could see the individual whiskers on his muzzle, the horse stretched out his neck, his lips delicately plucking the bread from Jacob's palm. The touch was brief, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it sent electricity through Jacob's entire body. Shadow had touched him willingly, had taken food from his hand, had chosen trust over fear. The horse stepped back immediately, chewing the bread while watching Jacob warily, but the barrier had been crossed. They had made physical contact, and the world had not ended. Jacob slowly lowered his arm, his heart pounding with the significance of what had just happened. "That was good, Shadow," he said quietly. "That was real good. You're a brave horse, braver than most people I know." Over the following days, the ritual repeated itself. Each morning after the regular feeding, Jacob would offer treats from his hand, apple slices or carrots or bits of bread. Shadow's approach became less hesitant with each repetition, until by the end of the 5th week, the horse was taking treats easily, sometimes even nickering softly as Jacob approached with food. The sound of that nicker, the first vocalization Shadow had made that wasn't born of fear or rage, nearly brought Jacob to tears. It was the sound of greeting, of recognition, of a connection forming between two beings who had both known too much loneliness. The next step came naturally, almost without Jacob consciously planning it. One morning, as Shadow took an apple slice from his hand, Jacob slowly lifted his other hand and rested it gently on the horse's neck. Shadow's skin twitched at the contact, and for a heartbeat Jacob thought the horse might bolt. But Shadow held steady, trembling slightly but not pulling away, allowing this first real touch that was neither food-related nor accidental. Jacob's hand rested on that dusty coat for perhaps 10 seconds before he slowly withdrew it, giving Shadow the dignity of accepting touch without being overwhelmed by it. That evening, Jacob sat on his usual crate and found himself talking to Shadow in a way he hadn't talked to anyone since his wife left. "I know something about being broken," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife, Sarah, she left 3 years ago. Said I loved horses more than I loved her, and maybe she was right in a way. I understood horses better than I understood her needs. Could talk to them easier than I could talk to her." Shadow had moved close, standing perhaps 6 feet away, his ears focused entirely on Jacob as if he understood the weight behind the words. "When she left, I thought I was fine with it. Told myself it was for the best, that we wanted different things. But truth is, I've been as broken as you were when they brought you in. Just better at hiding it." The confession hung in the air between them, and Jacob felt something loosen in his chest, some tight knot of grief and guilt he had been carrying for 3 years without acknowledging it. "Maybe that's why I understood you from the start," he continued. "Why I could see past the violence to the fear underneath. We're alike, you and me. Both damaged by circumstances we didn't ask for, both surviving the best way we know how, both convinced we're better off alone." The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, and the prairie stretched out around them in all its vast indifference. But here, in this small corral on an abandoned ranch, 2 broken creatures had found something that neither had expected to find again: connection, purpose, and the beginning of healing. The following week brought Sheriff Bradley back to the ranch, this time with several other men from town. Jacob watched them approach with a sinking feeling in his stomach, recognizing the grim determination in their postures. The sheriff dismounted and approached the corral where Jacob was working, his expression apologetic but firm. "Jacob, we need to talk about the horse." "What about him?" Jacob asked, though he already knew where this was going. "There's been talk in town. Some folks are concerned that you're wasting time and resources on an animal that will never be safe around people. Marcus Thornton, the banker, has offered to buy this property, but he won't do it while that horse is here. Says it's a liability." Jacob set down the fence post he had been carrying and faced the sheriff squarely. "Shadow isn't a liability. He's not dangerous unless he's threatened, and he's making progress every day. You've seen the progress, Sheriff. You've watched him change." The sheriff nodded reluctantly. "I have, and it's remarkable. I'll give you that. But remarkable doesn't mean safe. The town council has been discussing the situation, and there are those who think it's time to end this experiment before someone gets hurt. They want the horse destroyed." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He had known this might come, had sensed the undercurrent of disapproval from certain members of the community, but hearing it stated so baldly still shocked him. "Over my dead body," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that made the sheriff take a step back. "This horse has harmed no one since I took him. He's healing, learning to trust, becoming what he was meant to be before humans broke him with their cruelty and ignorance. You're not putting him down, not while I have breath in my body to stop you." The sheriff held up his hands in a placating gesture, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "Nobody's doing anything today, Jacob. I'm just here to inform you of the situation and to ask if you'd be willing to demonstrate that the horse is safe, some kind of public showing that would ease people's concerns." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. "You want me to parade Shadow in front of a crowd? Put him in a situation where he'll be surrounded by the very thing that terrifies him most? That's exactly what would set him back weeks and prove to everyone that he's still dangerous." "What do you suggest then?" the sheriff asked. "Sheriff, because doing nothing isn't going to satisfy the people who are pushing for action. Marcus Thornton has significant influence in this town, and he's making it clear that he sees that horse as an obstacle to progress." Jacob looked past the sheriff to where Shadow stood, watching the group of men with alert wariness. The horse hadn't bolted or shown aggression at their presence, but Jacob could see the tension in his posture, the way his weight was balanced on his back legs, ready to flee if necessary. This was the very scenario Jacob had been trying to avoid. Multiple humans creating pressure and stress that could undo all the careful trust building of the past 6 weeks. "Give me 2 more months, Jacob said finally. 2 months to continue working with him, to build his confidence to the point where he can handle being around people without panic. Then I'll do a demonstration, but on my terms, with people I choose, in a controlled environment." The sheriff exchanged glances with the other men, who had remained mounted and were watching the conversation with varying degrees of skepticism. 2 months is a long time, Jacob. A lot can happen in 2 months. Marcus Thornton isn't known for his patience. "Then Marcus Thornton will have to learn some," Jacob replied sharply. "This isn't about real estate transactions or business deals. This is about a living creature who deserves a chance at life. If people in this town can't understand that, if they'd rather kill something they don't understand than give it time to heal, then maybe I've misjudged the character of Copper Creek." The rebuke hung in the air, and Jacob saw several of the men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. These were decent people for the most part, ranchers and shopkeepers who generally believed in fairness and giving folks a second chance. But they were also practical people who understood risk and liability, who had families to protect and businesses to maintain. The tension between compassion and pragmatism was written clearly on their faces. One of the mounted men, old Daniel Cooper, whose son Billy had been injured by Shadow months ago, finally spoke up. "My boy still limps from what that horse did to him. You understand why some of us have trouble seeing past that, Jacob?" Jacob met the old man's eyes directly, refusing to look away from the pain and anger he saw there. "I do understand, Mr. Cooper, and I'm sorrier than I can say that Billy was hurt. But Shadow didn't attack your son out of malice. He was terrified, cornered, and he defended himself the only way he knew how. If we could ask Billy what happened that day, I suspect he'd tell us that he approached too fast, got too close, maybe even had a rope or whip in his hand, not because your son is cruel, but because that's how everyone in this territory has been taught to handle difficult horses." Daniel Cooper's face reddened, and for a moment Jacob thought the old man might ride forward and start a physical confrontation. But then Cooper's shoulders sagged slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice was tired rather than angry. "Billy did have a rope, was trying to lasso the horse, thinking he could impress his friends by being the one to catch the wild stallion. Stupid kid bravado. The horse spooked, and Billy got trampled when he wouldn't get out of the way fast enough. The admission seemed to cost him something, as if speaking the truth diminished his right to anger. But then he straightened in his saddle and fixed Jacob with a hard stare. But that doesn't change the fact that the horse is dangerous. Doesn't change the fact that he's killed before and could kill again." "Or it changes everything," Jacob replied quietly. "Because it means Shadow's violence has always been defensive, always been a response to human aggression rather than unprovoked attack. That's the difference between a dangerous animal and a traumatized one. Dangerous animals attack without cause. Traumatized animals defend themselves against perceived threats. The distinction matters, Mr. Cooper. It matters a great deal." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with various men offering opinions and concerns, while Jacob defended Shadow's right to continued life and rehabilitation. By the end, a compromise had been reached. Jacob would have 8 weeks to continue his work with Shadow, and at the end of that time he would demonstrate to a committee of townspeople that the horse could be safely handled. If the demonstration went well, Shadow would be allowed to live and remain at the ranch. If it failed, if Shadow showed aggression or unmanageable fear, The committee would vote on his fate. After the men left, Jacob walked to the corral and leaned against the fence, suddenly exhausted. Shadow approached cautiously, the horse's instincts clearly telling him that something significant had just occurred, even if he couldn't understand the specifics. Jacob reached out, and Shadow allowed him to stroke the horse's neck, the touch now familiar and comforting to both of them. 8 weeks, Jacob said softly. 8 weeks to prove to a bunch of scared, skeptical people that you're worth saving. No pressure, right? Shadow pushed his nose against Jacob's shoulder, a gesture that had become his way of seeking reassurance, and Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. The progress they had made was real and significant, but was it enough? Could Shadow possibly be ready to face a group of strangers in just 8 weeks? That night, Jacob lay in his bedroll staring at the rafters of the barn, his mind churning through possibilities and strategies. The truth was that Shadow had made remarkable progress, but he was still far from being the calm, manageable horse that most people expected. He was still easily spooked by sudden movements, still defensive if approached without warning, still carrying the deep scars of his traumatic past. The idea of putting him in front of a committee for judgment felt like a betrayal of everything Jacob had been working toward, but the alternative was worse. If Jacob refused to demonstrate Shadow's progress, the town council would almost certainly vote to have the horse destroyed. The following morning, Jacob began a new phase of Shadow's training, one focused specifically on preparing the horse for interaction with strangers. He started by changing his own approach, varying the times he fed Shadow, approaching from different angles, occasionally wearing a hat or jacket that Shadow hadn't seen before. Anything to help the horse understand that not all change meant danger, that unexpected elements didn't have to trigger panic. Shadow was confused by these changes at first, clearly preferring the predictable routine they had established. But gradually, he began to accept the variations, understanding that regardless of how Jacob looked or when he arrived, the human's essential nature remained calm and trustworthy. Next, Jacob began introducing sounds that might occur during the demonstration. He would bang tools together, whistle loudly, clap his hands, all while standing near Shadow and offering treats and reassurance. The horse startled at first, but Jacob's presence and the consistent reward of food helped Shadow associate unusual noises with safety rather than threat. They spent hours each day on these exercises, Jacob patiently working through Shadow's fear responses, always pushing just slightly beyond the horse's comfort zone, but never so far that real panic set in. By the end of the second week after the sheriff's visit, Shadow was handling the noise exercises well. He would flinch at loud sounds but wouldn't bolt, would pin his ears but wouldn't attack. It was progress, real and measurable. But Jacob knew it wasn't enough. The presence of multiple humans would be an entirely different challenge, one that would require careful planning and gradual exposure. He needed to bring other people to the ranch, people Shadow could learn to tolerate in controlled circumstances before the final demonstration. The question was who? Most of the townspeople either feared Shadow or actively wanted him dead. Jacob needed someone who would understand the delicate nature of what they were attempting, someone patient and willing to move at Shadow's pace. The answer came to him as he was falling asleep that night. Thomas Brennan. The old liveryman was skeptical of Jacob's methods, but he was also experienced with horses and fundamentally kind-hearted despite his gruff exterior. If Jacob could get Brennan to work with Shadow successfully, it would prove that the horse could tolerate strangers and provide a template for introducing others. The next morning, Jacob rode into town to make his case. Thomas Brennan was shoeing a mare when Jacob found him at the livery stable, his leather apron dusted with the metallic shavings that accumulated during the filing process. The old man looked up as Jacob approached, his weathered face registering surprise at seeing the hermit rancher in town during what should have been peak training time. "Something wrong at the ranch?" Brennan asked, setting down his rasp and straightening with the careful movements of a man whose back had endured 60 years of hard labor. Jacob shook his head. I need your help, Thomas. I need someone who understands horses to come out to the ranch and work with Shadow. Help me prove he can tolerate strangers before the demonstration in 8 weeks. The old liveryman's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. You want me to get in a corral with the horse that killed Jim Patterson? At my age? Jacob, I like you, but I'm not suicidal. I'm not asking you to get in the corral with him, Jacob clarified. At least not at first. I'm asking you to simply be present, to let Shadow get used to seeing another human around, to gradually build up to the point where he can accept you the way he's learned to accept me. Brennan studied Jacob's face for a long moment, his sharp eyes seeing more than most people gave him credit for. This really means that much to you, saving this horse? It means everything, Jacob admitted quietly. Because if we can save Shadow, if we can prove that patience and understanding can heal even the deepest trauma, then maybe there's hope for all the other broken things in this world. Maybe there's even hope for broken people. The old man was quiet, his gaze drifting to the mare he had been shoeing, a gentle creature who stood patiently waiting for him to finish his work. Finally, he sighed and pulled off his apron. When do you want to start? They rode back to the ranch together, Brennan on his sturdy gelding and Jacob on the bay mare he kept for trips to town. The journey took just under an hour, and Jacob used the time to explain his methods, describing the slow process of building trust through consistency and patience. Brennan listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful as he processed this approach that was so different from the traditional breaking methods he had used throughout his career. When they arrived at the ranch, Shadow was standing in the shade of the lean-to, but his head came up immediately at the sight of the unfamiliar horse and rider. His ears went back, and his body tensed, all the warning signs that Jacob had learned to read over the past weeks. We'll stay mounted for now, Jacob said quietly. Let him see you from a distance. Get used to the idea that other humans exist in his world. They positioned themselves about 50 feet from the corral, close enough that Shadow could see them clearly, but far enough that he didn't feel immediately threatened. For 20 minutes, they simply sat on their horses, not approaching or making any sudden movements, just existing in Shadow's peripheral awareness. Gradually, the stallion's ears came forward again, and the tension left his body. He was still watchful, but the panic had subsided. This is how it starts, Jacob explained. Just presence without pressure. We do this for several days until he stops reacting to your arrival. Then we dismount and stand by the fence. Then eventually, after he's comfortable with that, we can think about entering the corral. Brennan nodded slowly, beginning to understand the patience required for this method. How long did it take before he let you touch him? 6 weeks, Jacob replied. 6 weeks of being present every day, of feeding him and talking to him and never once making a threatening move. The breakthrough came during a storm when he was too frightened to maintain his defenses. That's when he finally let me in. Over the following days, Brennan came to the ranch every afternoon, a commitment that surprised many in town who knew the old liveryman's general skepticism about Jacob's methods. Each day, they would sit on their horses at a respectful distance, while Shadow gradually became accustomed to the presence of this new human. Brennan proved to be an excellent student of Jacob's approach, understanding instinctively when to push forward and when to simply hold steady. He never showed impatience or frustration, even when progress seemed imperceptible. By the end of the first week, Shadow would continue eating his hay even when Brennan was visible, no longer seeing the old man as an immediate threat. By the second week, they were able to dismount and stand by the fence without Shadow retreating to the far corner. It was during the third week that the real breakthrough occurred. Jacob was in the corral with Shadow, grooming the horse with long, slow strokes of a soft brush while talking quietly. Brennan was standing outside the fence as usual, watching with the focused attention that had made him one of the best horsemen in the territory, despite his traditional methods. "Thomas," Jacob called out, "why don't you try offering him an apple? Shadow knows apples mean good things. He's learned to associate them with safety and kindness." Brennan looked uncertain but reached into his pocket, where Jacob had told him to keep treats. He pulled out an apple and held it up so Shadow could see it, then slowly extended his arm through the fence rails. Shadow's attention fixed on the apple, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent. For a long moment, the horse stood frozen between desire for the treat and suspicion of the unfamiliar hand offering it. Then, in a decision that made Jacob's heart soar, Shadow took 3 steps toward Brennan and delicately lifted the apple from the old man's palm. Brennan's face registered shock and something that looked almost like wonder as the horse's whiskers tickled his skin. The moment lasted only seconds before Shadow stepped back to eat his prize, but it was enough. "Well, I'll be damned," Brennan breathed. "He actually did it. He trusted me." "That's how it starts," Jacob said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "One small act of trust leading to another until the fear is replaced by understanding." After Brennan left that evening, Jacob sat with Shadow in the gathering dusk, feeling hopeful for the first time since the sheriff's ultimatum. They had 5 weeks left before the demonstration, and they had just proven that Shadow could learn to trust someone other than Jacob. It was a crucial step, one that suggested the horse might actually be able to handle the stress of the upcoming test. But Jacob knew they couldn't stop with just Brennan. Shadow needed to be comfortable with multiple people, needed to learn that humans in general could be trusted, not just the 2 men who had shown him patience. The next person Jacob approached was young Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of the town's schoolteacher. Sarah was 16, quiet and gentle, with a natural affinity for animals that reminded Jacob of himself at that age. She had been one of the few people in town who had defended Shadow when others called for his destruction, arguing that every creature deserved a chance at redemption. When Jacob explained what he needed, Sarah's face lit up with an eagerness that made her look even younger than her years. "I'd be honored to help, Mr. Hayes. When can I start?" They began the same process with Sarah that they had used with Brennan, starting with distant observation and gradually moving closer as Shadow became comfortable with her presence. But Sarah brought something different to the interaction. Where Brennan had been methodical and patient in a practiced way, Sarah was naturally empathetic, seeming to understand Shadow's emotional state almost intuitively. She would hum soft melodies while standing by the fence, and Jacob noticed that Shadow's ears would swivel toward her voice, the horse clearly finding comfort in the gentle sounds. Within 2 weeks, Sarah was able to hand-feed Shadow treats through the fence, and the horse would actually nicker when he saw her approaching, a greeting he had previously reserved only for Jacob. The transformation was remarkable, and it gave Jacob hope that Shadow might actually be ready for the demonstration when the time came. But there was still the matter of physical handling. The committee wouldn't be satisfied with a horse that could take treats through a fence. They would want to see Shadow handled directly, led with a rope, perhaps even saddled. These were challenges that Jacob had been avoiding, knowing how much pressure they would put on Shadow's still fragile trust. One evening, after both Brennan and Sarah had gone home, Jacob entered the corral with a soft lead rope in his hands. Shadow watched him approach with interest rather than alarm, and Jacob's heart hammered with hope and fear in equal measure. "Easy, boy," Jacob murmured. "Just want to try something new. Nothing scary, I promise." He moved slowly to Shadow's side and gently draped the rope over the horse's neck. Shadow tensed but didn't bolt, his trust in Jacob strong enough to override his instinct to flee from the thing that had been used to hurt him before. Jacob let the rope rest there for several minutes, just getting Shadow used to the sensation, then slowly removed it and stepped away. "Good boy," he said softly. "That's all for today." Just wanted you to remember that ropes don't always mean pain. They worked on rope desensitization every day after that, with Jacob gradually increasing the amount of contact until Shadow would stand calmly with a lead rope clipped to the halter Jacob had managed to slip on during a grooming session. It was progress, significant progress, but Jacob knew they were running out of time. The demonstration was scheduled for a Saturday morning in late autumn, when the air carried the first real bite of approaching winter, and the prairie grass had faded to the color of old gold. Jacob woke before dawn with his stomach in knots, anxiety churning through him in waves that made it difficult to breathe. He had done everything he could to prepare Shadow for this day, had worked tirelessly for 8 weeks to build the horse's confidence and trust. But there were so many variables he couldn't control, so many ways this could go catastrophically wrong. Shadow sensed his tension immediately when Jacob climbed down from the loft. The horse was already awake, standing in the center of the corral, with his ears pricked forward, reading Jacob's body language with the acute sensitivity that had developed between them over 3 months of constant companionship. Jacob forced himself to take a deep breath and slow his racing heart. If he went into this day carrying fear and stress, Shadow would feel it and respond accordingly. He needed to project the same calm confidence he had maintained throughout their work together, even if it was the last thing he actually felt. The committee would arrive at 10 o'clock. Jacob had negotiated carefully about who would be present, excluding anyone who had openly called for Shadow's death and insisting on a small group rather than the crowd some townspeople had wanted. The final committee consisted of Sheriff Bradley, Thomas Brennan, Dr. Morrison, Daniel Cooper, whose son had been injured, and Mayor Whitmore, who would cast the deciding vote if the others were split. 5 men to judge whether Shadow deserved to live or die. 5 men who would determine whether the past 3 months of patient work had been enough. Jacob went through the morning routine with exaggerated normalcy, feeding Shadow at the usual time, grooming him with long, steady strokes that calmed them both. The horse's coat had transformed over the past months. Where once it had been dull and dusty, it now gleamed with health, the deep black catching the morning light like polished obsidian. Shadow had gained weight too, his ribs no longer visible, his muscles filling out to reveal the powerful build that had always been hidden beneath neglect and starvation. He was beautiful, Jacob realized with a pang of fierce protectiveness. Magnificent in the way that only a truly wild thing could be, even after choosing to trust. Thomas Brennan arrived first, a full hour before the others, and Jacob felt gratitude flood through him at this gesture of support. The old liveryman dismounted and approached the corral with the careful confidence he had developed over weeks of working with Shadow. "Morning, Jacob." "Morning, Shadow. Ready for your big day?" Shadow nickered at Brennan's voice, moving to the fence to accept the apple the old man always brought. This simple interaction, so casual and easy, was the result of countless hours of patient work. Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion watching it. "Think he's ready?" Brennan asked quietly, his eyes on the horse rather than Jacob. "As ready as he'll ever be," Jacob replied. "But Thomas, if this goes wrong, if they vote to destroy him, I need you to promise me something." Brennan turned to face him, his weathered face serious. "What? Help me get him out of here. Tonight, before they can carry out any sentence. I won't let them kill him because he couldn't perform for an audience." The old man was quiet for a long moment, the weight of what Jacob was asking settling between them. "That would be stealing, Jacob. Could land you in jail." "I don't care," Jacob said simply. "I'd rather spend a year in jail knowing Shadow is alive somewhere, free and wild like he was meant to be, than spend the rest of my life knowing I stood by and let them murder him for the crime of being afraid." Brennan studied Jacob's face, seeing the absolute conviction there, the willingness to sacrifice everything for this horse he had spent 3 months saving. Finally, the old man nodded. "If it comes to that, I'll help you. But let's hope it doesn't. Let's hope these men can see what I've seen, that this horse is worth saving." The others arrived together just before 10, a small procession of riders approaching the ranch with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Daniel Cooper looked like he would rather be anywhere else, his jaw set and his eyes hard as he dismounted. Sheriff Bradley maintained his usual neutral expression, but Jacob could see the tension in his shoulders. Dr. Morrison appeared cautiously optimistic, while Mayor Whitmore simply looked tired, as if he was already exhausted by the political maneuvering this situation had created in town. "Gentlemen," Jacob greeted them, his voice steadier than he felt. "Thank you for coming. I appreciate your willingness to give Shadow this chance." The mayor cleared his throat, pulling a piece of paper from his pocket. "We're here as agreed, Mr. Hayes. The terms of today's demonstration are as follows. You will show us that the horse, Shadow, can be safely handled, that he responds to commands, that he tolerates human presence without aggression. If we are satisfied that he poses no danger to the community, we will vote to allow him to remain here under your care. If we are not satisfied, the vote will determine his fate." The formal language made it sound like a trial, which Jacob supposed it was. Shadow was being judged for the crime of defending himself, for having the audacity to fight back when humans tried to break him. Jacob swallowed his anger and nodded. "I understand. Shall we begin?" He entered the corral alone first, wanting Shadow to see him and settle before the pressure of multiple observers added to the stress. Shadow moved to him immediately, pressing his nose against Jacob's shoulder in the greeting that had become their ritual. Jacob stroked the horse's neck and spoke quietly, words meant only for Shadow's ears. "We can do this, boy. Just trust me like you've been trusting me. Nothing's going to hurt you today." He clipped the lead rope to Shadow's halter and began walking, the horse following easily at his shoulder. They made several circuits of the corral, while the committee watched from outside the fence, Jacob demonstrating how responsive Shadow had become. "Stop," he said quietly, and Shadow halted immediately. "Walk on," and they resumed their pace. The basic commands they had practiced endlessly over the past weeks flowed smoothly. Shadow's attention focused entirely on Jacob, reading his body language and responding with the partnership they had built through patience and respect. Now for the harder part. Jacob led Shadow to the fence where the committee stood, close enough that the men could see the horse clearly. Close enough that Shadow's old fears of crowds and threatening humans would be triggered if the trust between them wasn't strong enough. Shadow's steps became less certain as they approached, his ears swiveling nervously, his nostrils flaring as he scented the unfamiliar humans. Jacob felt the horse's hesitation through the lead rope, the tremor that ran through Shadow's body as every instinct screamed at him to flee. "Easy," Jacob murmured, his voice calm and reassuring. "These men won't hurt you. I'm right here. You're safe." Shadow held his ground, though Jacob could see the effort it cost him. The horse's eyes were wide, showing white around the edges, and his muscles were bunched tight, ready to explode into flight at the slightest provocation. But he stayed, trusting Jacob's presence and voice enough to override the fear that had defined so much of his life. "Thomas," Jacob called out, "would you approach slowly and offer him a treat?" Brennan moved carefully, telegraphing his intentions, one hand extended with an apple visible. Shadow's head came up, his attention fixing on Brennan, and for a heartbeat, Jacob thought the horse might bolt. Then recognition flickered in those intelligent eyes. This was the human who had been visiting for weeks, who had always brought food and kindness, who had proven himself safe through consistent, patient interaction. Shadow stretched out his neck and took the apple, and Jacob heard Dr. Morrison let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The demonstration continued for another 20 minutes, with Jacob leading Shadow through various exercises that showed the horse's responsiveness and trust. They practiced stopping and starting, turning left and right, backing up on command. Every movement was smooth and cooperative, Shadow following Jacob's cues with an attentiveness that spoke to the deep bond they had formed, The committee watched in silence, their faces revealing little of what they were thinking, though Jacob caught Dr. Morrison nodding approvingly several times. The real test came when Jacob asked if anyone else wanted to try interacting with Shadow. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for a long moment, no one moved. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel Cooper stepped forward. His weathered face was set in hard lines, but there was something in his eyes that might have been curiosity, or perhaps the desire to confront the creature that had harmed his son. "I'll try," Cooper said gruffly. "Show me what to do." Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment of greatest risk. Cooper had every reason to approach Shadow with anger or resentment, emotions the horse would sense immediately and respond to with fear or aggression. But refusing Cooper's offer would look like Jacob was hiding something, like he didn't truly believe Shadow was safe around strangers. "Come into the corral slowly," Jacob instructed, his voice calm despite his racing pulse. "Don't stare directly at him. Keep your movements predictable. I'm going to hand you the lead rope and you're just going to stand with him for a minute. That's all." Cooper nodded and climbed through the fence rails with the careful movements of a man who understood he was entering dangerous territory. Shadow's head came up immediately, his entire body tensing as this new human entered his space. Jacob felt the horse gather himself, muscles bunching in preparation for flight, and he placed a steadying hand on Shadow's neck. "Easy, boy," Jacob murmured. "This man isn't going to hurt you. He's just going to stand near us for a moment." The seconds stretched out like hours as Cooper approached. Jacob could see the warring emotions on the older man's face, the memory of his injured son, fighting against what his eyes were showing him now. This was not the crazed, vicious animal that had trampled Billy Cooper. This was a horse standing quietly under Jacob's gentle hand, fearful but controlled, choosing trust over violence despite every instinct screaming at him to defend himself. When Cooper was 5 feet away, he stopped without Jacob having to tell him. The old rancher seemed to understand instinctively that pushing closer would shatter the fragile calm. Shadow's breathing was rapid and shallow, his eyes fixed on Cooper with an intensity that made Jacob's stomach clench. This was the edge, the point where things could tip either toward violence or toward breakthrough. Jacob kept his hand on Shadow's neck, his touch light but constant, a reminder that he was there, that Shadow was not facing this threat alone. Cooper, to his credit, simply stood still and waited, making no aggressive moves, no demands, just standing there, an old man facing the creature that had hurt his son and finding the grace to give it a chance. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, Jacob saw Shadow's ears flick forward slightly. The horse was still tense, still afraid, but he was also curious. This human had entered his territory, but wasn't attacking or threatening, was simply existing in his space the way Jacob and Brennan and young Sarah had learned to do. Slowly, moving with exaggerated care, Cooper reached out his hand palm up and empty. "I ain't gonna hurt you, horse," the old man said quietly. "What happened with my boy, that was fear on both sides. Fear and stupidity and bad luck. But you didn't mean him harm, did you? You were just trying to survive." The words seemed to break something open in the tension that had been holding the moment suspended. Shadow took one step toward Cooper, then another, his nose stretching out to investigate this human who smelled of leather and tobacco and old grief. When Shadow's whiskers touched Cooper's palm, Jacob saw tears start in the old man's eyes. Cooper's other hand came up slowly to touch Shadow's neck, and the horse allowed it, standing still under the touch of this stranger who had approached him with respect rather than dominance. "I'll be damned," Cooper said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "He's not a killer at all. He's just a horse who was pushed too far." Jacob felt his own eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. That's all he ever was, Mr. Cooper. A horse who needed someone to see past his fear to the good creature underneath. Cooper stepped back carefully, his hand dropping away from Shadow's neck. He turned to the other committee members who were still standing outside the fence, his face transformed by what he had just experienced. "This horse ain't dangerous," he said firmly. "Ain't got a mean bone in his body. What he's got is sense enough to defend himself when he needs to, and sense enough to trust when he's given reason. That's not something to destroy. That's something to protect." The other men exchanged glances, and Jacob could see the shift happening in real time. Dr. Morrison was nodding in agreement. Brennan had a satisfied expression on his weathered face, and even Sheriff Bradley looked like he was reconsidering his position. Only Mayor Whitmore remained uncertain, his politician's face carefully neutral as he processed what he had witnessed. "Mr. Hayes," the mayor said finally, "I think we've seen enough. If you'll give us a few minutes to confer, we'll render our decision." Jacob led Shadow to the far side of the corral, giving the committee space to deliberate while keeping the horse calm through his presence and touch. Shadow was trembling slightly, the stress of the past hour finally catching up with him, and Jacob stroked his neck in long, soothing motions. "You did so good," he whispered, "so incredibly good. I'm proud of you, boy. Whatever happens now, you've proven yourself to me and to everyone who matters." The committee's discussion lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though to Jacob it felt like days. He watched their body language, trying to read the decision in their gestures and expressions, but they were too far away and keeping their voices too low for him to catch more than occasional words. Finally, they seemed to reach consensus, and Mayor Whitmore approached the fence alone, while the others remained in a group behind him. "Mr. Hayes," the mayor called out, "we've reached our decision." Jacob's heart stopped. This was it, the moment that would determine whether 3 months of patient work had been enough, whether love and understanding could triumph over fear and prejudice. He walked Shadow back to the fence, the horse following calmly at his shoulder, and waited for the words that would either save or condemn the magnificent creature he had come to love. "The committee has voted," Mayor Whitmore said, his voice carrying the formal weight of official pronouncement, and there was a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then the mayor's stern expression cracked into something that might have been a smile. "We vote unanimously to allow Shadow to remain here under your care, Mr. Hayes. What we've witnessed today is remarkable. You've proven that patience and understanding can accomplish what force never could. This horse is no danger to anyone, and frankly, the town of Copper Creek could learn something from the compassion and dedication you've shown." Jacob felt his knees go weak with relief. He reached out to steady himself against Shadow's solid bulk, and the horse pressed his nose against Jacob's shoulder in that familiar gesture of trust and affection. They had done it. Against all odds, against the prejudice and fear that had nearly condemned Shadow to death, they had proven that healing was possible, that broken things could be made whole again with time and patience and love. 6 months after the demonstration, Jacob stood at the fence of the expanded pasture he had built, watching Shadow run. The horse moved across the prairie grass with fluid power, his black coat gleaming in the spring sunshine, his mane flowing behind him like dark water. He was magnificent, everything Jacob had seen hidden beneath the fear and trauma of that first day. But more than his physical transformation, it was the joy in Shadow's movement that took Jacob's breath away. This was a horse who had remembered how to be free, who had learned that freedom and trust were not mutually exclusive. The past months had brought changes to both of them. Shadow had continued to grow in confidence, accepting not just Jacob and the handful of people he knew well, but also greeting visitors to the ranch with curiosity rather than terror. He would never be a horse for just anyone to ride. His spirit was too strong, his memory of abuse too deep for him to ever fully submit to traditional handling. But he had become a partner to Jacob, responding to voice commands and body language with an attentiveness that spoke to genuine connection rather than broken submission. Jacob had changed, too, in ways he was only beginning to understand. The work with Shadow had opened something in him that had been locked away since his wife left, a capacity for vulnerability and emotional connection that he had convinced himself was no longer part of who he was. In teaching Shadow to trust again, Jacob had somehow learned to trust again himself, not just in others, but in his own worth, his own capacity to love and be loved despite past failures and disappointments. Thomas Brennan had become a regular visitor to the ranch, no longer just helping with Shadow, but genuinely enjoying the old man's company. They would sit on the porch in the evenings watching Shadow graze while they talked about horses and life, and the peculiar ways that broken things sometimes healed stronger than they had been before. Young Sarah Mitchell came by twice a week, bringing her gentle presence and her songs that Shadow loved. She was talking about becoming a veterinarian, inspired by what she had witnessed with Shadow's rehabilitation. Even Daniel Cooper had returned several times, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. He would stand at the fence and watch Shadow, and once he had told Jacob that seeing the horse thrive had somehow helped him make peace with what had happened to his son. Billy's limp was permanent, but it was also a reminder that violence often came from fear rather than malice, that understanding and forgiveness were choices that could change everything. The town's attitude toward Jacob had shifted as well. Where once he had been seen as peculiar and solitary, now he was viewed with a kind of respect that bordered on admiration. People who had previously kept their distance would stop him on his occasional trips to town, asking advice about problem horses or simply wanting to hear about Shadow's progress. Jacob found himself uncomfortable with the attention at first, but gradually he came to understand that his work with Shadow had given people something they desperately needed in their harsh frontier lives: hope that broken things could be mended, that patience could triumph over violence, that love was stronger than fear. On this particular spring morning, Jacob had company. A young couple had traveled 2 days from a neighboring territory, bringing with them a scarred gelding that had been abused by previous owners and was now so fearful he could barely be approached. They had heard about the man who had saved the killer horse, and they wanted to learn his methods. Jacob had agreed to take them on as students, teaching them the principles of patience and respect that had guided his work with Shadow. The woman, whose name was Emma, watched Shadow run with tears streaming down her face. "Is it really possible?" she asked quietly. "Can horses who have been hurt so badly really learn to trust again?" Jacob followed her gaze to where Shadow had stopped running and was now grazing peacefully, the picture of contentment. "It's possible," he replied, "but it requires time and patience and a willingness to meet them where they are rather than demanding they become what we want. You can't rush healing. You can only provide the conditions that make it possible and then wait for it to happen in its own time." Emma's husband James was studying Jacob's setup with the keen eye of someone trying to understand every detail. "How long did it take before you could ride him?" he asked. Jacob smiled. "I don't ride him. Shadow's not a riding horse. He's a companion, a partner, a reminder that some things are valuable just for existing, not for what use we can make of them." James looked confused, clearly having assumed that the end goal of all this work was to produce a rideable mount. "Then what's the point? If you can't ride him, what good is he?" The question was one Jacob had heard before, and he had learned to answer it without judgment. Shadow's good is that he's alive and thriving instead of dead and forgotten. His good is that he reminds me every day that patience and love can heal wounds that violence only deepens. His good is that he's taught me and dozens of others that there are ways of being with animals and with each other that don't require dominance or submission, just mutual respect and understanding. He paused, watching Shadow lift his head to look toward them, ears pricked forward with interest. "And he's taught me that my own worth isn't measured by my usefulness, that I don't have to earn love through service or productivity, that I can just be, and that's enough. Those are lessons worth more than any horse I could ride." Emma nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. James still looked skeptical, but he was listening, and that was all Jacob could ask. They would find their own path with their damaged gelding, and perhaps along the way they would discover the same truths that Jacob had learned from Shadow. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the prairie in shades of amber and gold, Shadow trotted over to the fence where Jacob stood. The horse pushed his nose into Jacob's chest, that familiar gesture that had become their private language. Jacob wrapped his arms around Shadow's powerful neck and breathed in the scent of horse and grass and freedom. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing Shadow couldn't understand the words but hoping the feeling behind them would communicate. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for teaching me that broken things can heal. Thank you for reminding me what it means to be truly alive." Shadow's soft nicker was the only response, but it was enough. They stood together as the sun set over the prairie, man and horse, both survivors of different kinds of trauma, both finding in each other something precious they had thought was lost forever. The possibility of trust, the reality of healing, and the profound truth that love given freely, without demands or expectations, had the power to transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength and wisdom. In the distance, Jacob could hear Emma and James settling their gelding into the temporary corral he had prepared. Tomorrow they would begin the slow work of rebuilding trust with an animal who had every reason to fear humans. It would be hard and frustrating and require more patience than they probably imagined they possessed. But it would also be rewarding beyond measure, because in saving their horse, they would discover something essential about themselves and about the kind of world they wanted to create. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, and Shadow moved away from the fence to resume his grazing. Jacob watched him for a moment longer, then turned toward the barn and the simple supper waiting for him. His life was not what he had planned or imagined. It was better, richer, more meaningful. All because one day he had chosen to see past violence and fear to the broken creature underneath, and in doing so had found his own path to healing. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of other damaged horses who would find their way to this ranch, of other broken people who would learn that patience and love could work miracles. Jacob smiled and climbed the ladder to his loft, grateful beyond words for the unexpected journey that had brought him here, to this place of purpose and peace, all because of a wild horse that everyone else had wanted to destroy.